well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being patient. I think we've been having some Zoom issues here on campus the last couple of days, so I'm glad most of you were able to join us, and we probably will have some additional folks joining throughout the next hour. My name is Sarah Ripp, and I'm the Assistant Director for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. Just wanted to mention that, as you probably just heard, we are recording today's session, so if you need to step away or you have any questions after the fact, we will post this on our website and our YouTube channel. Also, at the end of the presentation, Francisco will be taking questions, and you're welcome to post them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and we will, or he will take your questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kata Belin, who is our faculty director, who will introduce our speaker today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.
Hello, welcome to today's lecture. I have an enormous pleasure to introduce Professor Francisco Rosado-May, who is going to deliver a lecture titled Intercultural Education in Mexico, Implication for Natural Resources Conservation. Professor Rosado-May is a past president of the University of Quintana Roo and also a founding president of the Intercultural Maya University of Quintana Roo, where he works right now. He holds a PhD from the University of California in Santa Cruz, and he says that he is an agroecologist. But for me, Professor Rosado-May is a model transdisciplinary researcher, and I will explain why. Not only because most of his publications appear in collaborations with people from different diverse disciplines, but also because most of his research is focused on a purpose, on a goal, practical problem. And the way I read it, he is trying to show that intercultural education and collaboration, if it pays sufficient amount of attention to the knowledge of the indigenous people of their environment, Mayan people knowledge of their environment, it will allow to put together regulations and policies which will help protect all that is still left of the beautiful environment of that part of the world. Yucatan, its water, its forest, its biodiversity that had been for thousands of years inhabited by the Maya people. And this is a part of the world and a problem that is also very close to my own heart. And I'm looking forward to this lecture. So without taking more time, I will pass it to Professor Rosado-May. Francisco, thank you so much for being here with us. Welcome to Madison virtually.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. It's my pleasure to be here, exchanging some ideas and conversation with all of you. So without further ado, let me share my screen and start. Do you all see my screen now?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, this is a beautiful picture of the first cohort that graduated from my university, Universidad Intercultural Maya de Quintana Roo. Okay, today, as Dr. Bailey said, we're going to talk about intercultural education in Mexico and its implications for natural resources conservation. There will be three parts. There is a fourth part at the end of the discussion, which I hope to transmit as well. So we'll start with a brief history and context of the education. And to do so, here is a timeline. And we have the scientific method established in the 1600s, 1700s, more or less. And before that, it was all indigenous ways of learning. And after that, together with the scientific method, the indigenous ways of learning and constructing knowledge still prevail, all to today. Today, we are more local and which means that we're global, but also local. And here are some of the situations that happened in Mexico that led, especially these two things, the Casta War in Yucatan and the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, which led to what we know now, the intercultural systems of education. So, kind of from 1991 to date, in Quintana Roo, students have the possibility of attending the Universidad de Quintana Roo, like the University of Wisconsin. And indigenous students there could only access in conventional education via fellowships, quotas, or special tutoring programs, but not tapping into their ways of learning or constructing knowledge. But on January 24, 2001, the Mexican Constitution was reformed. And on October 30, 2006, 3 years after the first intercultural university in Mexico, in the state of Mexico was created, the state of Quintana Roo created an intercultural university for Maya students, covering the whole Yucatan Peninsula. And from 2007 to date, the students in Quintana Roo have at least the option of attending conventional education at the University of Quintana Roo, technological education, which is also based on conventional ways of learning, intercultural education at the Universidad Intercultural Maya de Quintana Roo, and there are some examples of indigenous educational model. I'll go into that detail later on. So now, what is intercultural education at university level in Mexico? As I said, the indigenous students, or for that matter, any student, has all these options to get a higher education in Quintana Roo. Conventional, intercultural, and there are some signs of intracultural education. So we have basically 3 models of education: conventional, intercultural, and intracultural education. Let's go into some details a little bit. The federal government created this program to open intercultural universities in places all over Mexico. Right now, there are 15 states of Mexico which offer to indigenous students an intercultural educational model. Number 1 is in this pink area, is mostly Yucatec Maya, covering the whole region. That's where my university, Intercultural Maya University, is located. And throughout the whole country, we have different universities covering different indigenous peoples. All of the 63 more or less peoples, meaning 63 different types of basically linguistic types of indigenous cultures in Mexico. So let's go into more detail. Searching for the right educational system in Quintana Roo meant the construction of an intercultural model. And to do so, we had to know, we had to learn, we had to acknowledge that education could be causing a centrifugal effect, which means that from the core center of the community, the source of identity, culture, language, and knowledge, the students and the identity and the language and the culture is expelled because of the centrifugal effect of education. And some centrifugal factors are education, policies, politics, migration, religion, etc. All of them pushing for distracting the core of the indigenous peoples. Okay, but the same factors can be used to reverse the process from centrifugal to centripetal effect, meaning attract the students into the core of the culture, attending the identity, the culture, language, and ways of learning and constructing knowledge. Once we understood that process, then we could understand why we have all these models of education available to students in the state of Quintana Roo. A conventional education model does not take into account the culture or the language or the ways of learning by indigenous students, nor the technological education offers that possibility. But on the opposite side, the intercultural model claims that we first, the indigenous peoples, first have to take time and recover all of that has been lost regarding language, regarding ways of learning, regarding culture. And that is a very appealing logic, because many students will say, and faculty will say, yes, we need to provide conditions for indigenous peoples to actually regain confidence, to actually relearn of their own culture. But the only problem with that logic, which is very strong, is that it assumes that while indigenous cultures try to get to the point in which they can say, okay, now I am able to interact with other cultures because I am already strong. This logic assumes that this other culture will stop its development until this other one, the indigenous ones, will say, okay, I'm ready for us to interact. No, that doesn't happen. This goes on its own, developing on its own, each culture, right? So the intercultural education tries to say, okay, I have an indigenous culture already in existence, already functioning, about its language, about its culture, about its way of constructing knowledge. And I also have this other way, the Western way, the one that is based on the scientific method. Why don't I get the best of the two models and combine them so that I can provoke processes for intercultural learning to happen? That's the logic behind these models. And many people defending the conventional educational model would say, yeah, oh, wait a minute. 2 times 2 equals 4, no matter the culture, no matter the language. It is true, but the process to explain how to get to 4 multiplying 2 times 2 is different. In English, you say 2 times 2. So there is a mental process that facilitates the understanding of the 4. But in Spanish, we say dos por dos. And that basic hidden way of learning only leads to memorization. It doesn't explain where 4 comes from. And in Maya, we say cape, yaba, cape, which is basically the same way English says 2 times 2. It's basically the same. So language matters. And if an educational model doesn't take into account that logic of understanding processes, because it doesn't incorporate the local language, there is no good process of education. Okay. Now, this slide tries to represent what I just discussed. The intercultural model of education attracts students to the core, to the center of indigenous identity. The conventional way of learning draws away the indigenous students from their core, from their indigenous identity, to a different way of learning, a global scientific method type of learning, away from their own way. The intercultural model tries to get the best of both, of the indigenous and the global scientific method, and build I repeat, and establish conditions for building an intercultural way of learning. That's the idea behind this slide. So at my university, we were able to put forward a working definition on what is intercultural education. And we say that intercultural education is the result of a process which takes place in a safe environment, allowing the manifestation and development of different ways of learning, constructing, innovating, and transmitting knowledge, local and non-local. Example, gratia, the scientific method. And as a result of this process, new knowledge emerges, that is intercultural knowledge, because there is a synergy in different ways of constructing knowledge. Okay, that's the working definition that we have, working on there in my university. And based on that definition, I'm not going to go into details in this slide, but I just wanted to present that the indicators that are used in Mexico to measure the quality and the efficiency of any school, based on that definition, we reach probably the top in most of the universities in Mexico. I mean, almost 100% of our students get a job in their field of education. And so very, very important, very good indicators of achievement. Now let's get into the examples of interculturality. On your left, you will see where Mexico is located. And you will see also a square showing the Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala and Belize. These three countries, Mexico, Yucatan Peninsula, part of Tabasco as well, and Guatemala and Belize, we host what is known as the Selva Maya, which is the second largest natural protected, not protected, conserved area, only after the Amazon. It's a huge area. Now, of course, there are people living in these 14 million hectares plus of Selva Maya. And one of the, we did a study in one of the ejidos, which has international certification of the sustainable forest management. And just to be more familiar, Mérida City is over here, Cancun City is over here, Belize City is over here, Guatemala is somewhere in here. And in this small spot, there is an ejido called Nojbec. This ejido is a very good representative. It's probably the best of the ejidos in Mexico where the Selva Maya is located. And the question was, how come these guys master the management of the natural resources? Well, this ejido, Nojbec, is basically a Maya ejido. It's not only Maya, there are indigenous people from other states of Mexico, but most of them are Maya. Actually, Nojbec is a Maya name. In any way, 1984, the Mexican government and the German government put together a program called Plan Piloto Forestal, which was intended to make sure that the Selva Maya is conserved with the participation of the habitats of the ejidos in the area. And it worked in the state of Quintana Roo. How did it work for this particular ejido? And what is it that we can learn from it for other ejidos? All right. So 1984, the Germans and the Mexicans come to Nojbec. What they asked the Nojbec people was to join a program of Plan Piloto Forestal to make sure that the management of their forests is sustainable. When they got to Nojbec, this is only a colloquial expression of what happened, but it reflects actually what actually happened. They were talking about sustainable development. They were talking about sustainable management of the forests. So nobody understood what was sustainability. Nobody understood what these people talk about. And what happened is that there is a pyramid that explains the classical approach and shows that traditional knowledge is relegated to the lowest position in the pyramid. Okay, and this pyramid represents that at the top, that's where the hypotheses, that's where the theories are, that's where the concepts are. So when the Germans and the Mexicans came to Novec, they brought a concept and they thought that they could go top down and to get the people to join the program. Well, it took a little while for the people, but it also took openness in the mind of both locals and non-locals to understand that sustainable development in English, desarrollo sostenible in Spanish, is very closely related to a concept in Maya that is called Kanankash. So once the locals understood that what the foreigners meant was Kanankash, then the dialogue could happen in a much better way. So this pyramid didn't work there, and this other pyramid also, the top-down approach, the deduction approach, did not work. And it is because most indigenous peoples base the learning not on deduction, but on induction process. Okay? And this is a representation of the induction process. Most indigenous peoples learn based on experience, learn by doing. And from there, they have a process to build concepts. And that's how they built the Kanankash concept, which is similar to the sustainable development concept from the Western. And it wasn't until this happened in which both ways of learning and understanding could understand each other in a safe environment that the program developed. It was a dynamic process. Okay. So this is an example of how an intercultural process functions, and it works in many cases, but we don't call it intercultural approach. We don't understand the induction or the deduction process in constructing knowledge. We don't value the ways of the indigenous ways of learning, constructing, innovating, and transmitting knowledge. But when that happens, things like the conservation of the Selva Maya is explained. So in many of the small towns within the Selva Maya, the same process is happening. So just imagine if we understand better the intercultural processes, the great effect that we have in the conservation of natural resources. And here is another example. Agroecology, which is also a way for resource conservation in agricultural systems, is also an example of an intercultural process. The guy who's, this is Steve Gleasman, he's regarded as the founder of agroecology. The story of agroecology is very interesting. Let me remember what is my next slide. Okay, Steve Gleasman came to Tabasco in Mexico. And let me show you where Tabasco is. It's more or less somewhere in here. Glisman was working in a college, agricultural college, training future agronomists to apply green revolution in the humid tropics. But this college differentiated from other universities that ecology was part of the curriculum. And Glisman, as an ecologist, was hired to teach agroecology, to teach ecology in that college. So Glisman and other locals noticed that not all the agriculture in the area was Green Revolution agriculture. There was also traditional agriculture. And when they talked to the farmers didn't even have the word weed for the advances for the plants growing together with their crops. They had a generic term called monte. And depending on the effect of the monte on the crop, they call the monte good monte or bad monte. So we started looking at why these people don't even use the term weed or maleza in Spanish. And it turns out that many of those so-called weeds have allelopathic properties, which means that they were able to leak chemicals from the roots into the soil environment, which could help or harm the crops. And depending on the physiological moment of the crop, it could be a good monte or it could be a bad monte. So what the campesinos did there was to develop a management strategy for the weed, not eradicating the weed, meaning the monte, not eradicating the monte, but managing the monte. And that's how agroecology started. Now it's a science, but that was how it started. Again, it was an intercultural process, and but it was Western science who took the credit, not the indigenous peoples with the knowledge. There is a fight now. So that leads me to the next section of this talk. Cultures usually follow this bell-shaped curve. They start, they get to a highest point, and then go extinct. Many have gone extinct now. Languages, cultures, they go extinct. And the extinction is helped by bad policies or passive attitudes by the same indigenous peoples. They go extinct. And in the case of the Maya, the same process was happening. I had the Kukulkan from Chichen Itza pyramid showing the peak of the culture. But then it went down here. In 2007, on the way down to extinction, WINCRO was created. The idea of WINCRO then, based on the definition of intercultural education, and based on examples, two of them I just share with you, is hoping that it will change the bell curve into at least an S curve. And to do so, we need a strong role of government to push, and a strong role of faculty, students, local communities to pull the trend, the tendency. Maybe arriving to a global world class, and I emphasize global, because this process is driven by an intercultural thinking. Okay, that's the idea behind my university. And there are some steps that we already have identified. There was a time in which the Maya, the culture Maya, was protagonist. There was a time in which we were discriminated. now we are at the time where we are tolerated, and we should build the conditions to get again to be protagonists again. That's the philosophy, that's the idea, that's the thinking behind the intercultural education. So it is possible to say, based on the studies, that indigenous knowledge systems do create concepts in their own way and understand the natural, social, and community context. The process that indigenous ways of learning for constructing, innovating, and transmitting knowledge rests on the, I don't see the word, and the same principles used by science: analysis, synthesis, induction, and deduction. That's what we are uncovering now with our studies. And based on the above, we can build effective bridges to connect indigenous ways of learning, constructing, innovating, and transmitting knowledge to other ways, like the scientific method or others that are around in our world. So there are some suggested readings as well, and I hope that my slides will be shared with you all. And I think that's it for now on my side. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your time. So go ahead.
Thank you very much, Francisco. That was so interesting. I have so many questions, and I'm sure that others as well. And Alberto, I am sure, is also interested in that because it's close to his own research. So I think I'm going to let Jimena ask first question.
Hi, Francisco. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm tuning in from Canada right now, but I'm very interested in this because my own field is Indigenous education. And, you know, my first question is that this model is almost too good to be true, right? It sounds idealistic because one of the things that I think is difficult in these institutions is to have, when you say co-create knowledge, is to have that communication where there's a mutual recognition, because Western knowledge systems have often considered themselves to be superior to Indigenous knowledge systems, right? That has been kind of the discrimination of European-based education towards Indigenous forms of knowledge and education. So when you say we come together and there's this mutual understanding that we can benefit each other, do you really find that there is that respect and that mutual recognition? Because I find that that's the difficulty, to have real collaboration and real co-creation. There needs to be a mutual understanding, right? And for this to happen, you have to have people with Western training understand Indigenous ways of knowing in a respectful way, so that they don't bring their colonial perspective into this collaboration. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Sure, no problem. Well, yeah, when you talk about co-creation of knowledge, we add an adjective to that action. And the adjective is intercultural co-creation of knowledge. Because when we talk about co-creation of knowledge, any paper, in any journal, written by 2 or more authors is already co-creation, right? But what we mean is to get the types of knowledges, the ways of learning, working together. And that requires a bit of methodology, a bit of mind opening, a bit of setting safe environment to do so, but the outcome is just amazing. We haven't been able to move to different levels yet. I know a university in India where in our university, my legislation allows the hiring of faculty with no formal degree, but well-known people who are healers, who are leaders, etc., with a strong support from their community. We acknowledge that hiring them as faculty. We are the only university with that type of legislation. But in India, they did something beyond that. I'm talking about the university in Shillong, and this is a private university. So they incorporate to all of their PhD students somebody who has these characteristics of being a leader, of being well known, of having support of a community because of knowledge that he or she has on the committee of the students who's getting a PhD in that university. And yes, their normativity says all the members of a committee, of a PhD committee, have to have a PhD. Well, they develop a system and granted a PhD level to those local wise persons, sabios locales. And that's very interesting. So things are happening, and what else can I talk about? I think that more and more, right now, I had the experience of participating in many of the conferences, and I also gave some talks during the Food Systems Summit, which happened last year, organized by the UN and previously by FAO. And it didn't take that long for all the players to recognize that the conventional food system is explaining about 25% of the global warming that we have now, and explains about 80% of the biodiversity loss that we have now. And the food system that doesn't do that is the traditional food systems managed by indigenous people. So they change their minds, they change their attitudes, and now they are in the process of finding ways, effective ways to actually co-create interculturally knowledge, scientists and indigenous peoples. It's not yet to the point where it could be, but we are working in the right directions. So, yes, it sounds like a very a dream model. It's not been like that. It's very difficult. We have up and downs, but I've been able to document a lot of the things that we need to get to the points of success that I share with you. And in the case of NOPEC, for instance, they have had since 1990, over 30 years, 34 years, international certification of the sustainability of their forests, the longest of any ejido in Mexico. So in 34 years, there's been a culture in the community that I hope it will be passed on to the new generations to continue the process of sustainability. Great question, thank you.
Thank you, Francisco.
So if, while other people are thinking about questions, I'm going to follow up a little bit on Jimena's question and ask you, Francisco, a question that my students asked me in one of the classes when we were talking about the debate if we should be talking about indigenous science, indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And one of the students said, well, if we are learning from indigenous knowledges, aren't we just committing some sort of biopiracy? You know, how would you answer my students? I mean, because this is the heart of that intercultural co-production of knowledge that very often ends up with someone taking away indigenous knowledge and then patenting it and selling it back to the community.
Right, and there are many efforts now. Some of them are led by the UN to avoid that thing to happen. And each university should have a code of ethics to prevent that to happen, but not getting to the point in which we can have the, have you read the paper, Coyote Goes to School? There's a very interesting paper in which Coyote happened in Arizona. Coyote is an indigenous person. And he wanted to go to the university and study indigenous studies. And in the paper, the author says, well, Coyote goes to school and sees no indigenous faculty whatsoever in indigenous studies major. And then not only that, but when I tried to do my research, they asked me to fulfill many of the requirements, like if I were not an indigenous person. And he concludes and says, well, I think I should study white culture major. Maybe I will find the indigenous faculty and not to have too much trouble doing research in my own community and in my own culture. So we can go to both streams, but I think this is a process of education in which one of the things that we have not been able to do also is that when we write a paper, not only to have in the acknowledgement sections names of the indigenous peoples participating, but having them as co-authors as well. And in some cases, having them as first authors. So, and that is not easy because some of the journals do require academic background of the authors in order to validate the paper, and especially the first author. So, but slowly but surely, many journals now, there is one in Canada, I think it's called Intercultural Studies, that allows this mechanism to happen. And by the way, the concept of centrifugal and centripetal effect was taken from a book by John Malaya, who was a former president of a Canadian university. The book is great. It's been a few years out, but the book is great. I highly recommend it.
Alberta.
Yeah, thank you. I would happily yield to some of the students that are in the audience to ask questions, but if they're not ready, I'll just do like three questions, observations. Thank you, Francisco, for a great, very interesting talk. I was very impressed by the statistics of the outcomes of the university, that students find jobs and stay there. I wonder if you could say a little more about that, like what type of jobs, are a little bit of the curriculum, the fields that is studied. That's one thing. The second is just like an observation. Many for some of the audience to know that here at our university, we happen to teach Yucatec Maya. I hope we can continue this, maybe share these with the students of Yucatec Maya, with the instructor, and then maybe have a dialogue. If you can comment a little bit on the role of the language. I see another question by one of the students, so I'll stop there and see if you want to say a little bit about these two questions, and then if there's time, we can go to something else. So thank you, Francisco.
Yeah, well, I had the advantage of being the president of the university. You know, in Mexico, you can only be president for 4 years, and for many universities, you may have 4 other years. That was the case in my university. So I stayed all the way from 0 to 8 years. The first 8 years of the university, I was the president. And I had the experience of being president of the University of Quintana Roo. So that helped a lot. And I was able to read the Mexican policies, public policies regarding job creations. And I was lucky that during the years I was president, the federal government opened a lot of room for civil organizations to get money, not only from the federal government, but from other organizations as well. And at the same time, the number of jobs created by either the state government or the federal government was reducing. So the best way to get a job was actually to learn how to work in a civil society organization. So we train our students to do that. As part of the 4 years of studies, they learn how to write projects, they learn how to submit projects, and they learn the processes of evaluations and actually how to report to the IRS the money that you get, etc., etc., etc. So, bingo, when they left the university, many of them look for a job, government or private businesses. Many of them didn't get a job that way, and they remember, we have this tool, we have this training, and boom, the employment rate went all the way up to over 90% of the students graduated had a job. And many of them still today have their civil organizations working. So that's one way to explain it. And yet there is no magic formula to do that. One has to learn how to read the changes in the politics and public policies and find ways of how you can accommodate the curricula, the courses, and get the students ready to face the real world when they go out. And I forgot what was your other question.
It was just about the Yucatec Maya that we have this year.
That's been a struggle and still is. One of the criticisms I have for the faculty who teach Maya in my university is that they lack the training in fields like epistemology. Maybe, I don't know, 50% possibility that they teach in any university. When they say good morning in Maya, they will teach it like malo king, because malo is good, king is dead, malo king. But you know what? I never heard from my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, the word malo king to say good morning. It's a change, you know. It's because they don't know the epistemology of the words. Then they think that by saying Maloki, and it's used so many times that it sounds normal, but it's not. So that's one thing that I would say about teaching any other languages, especially native languages, because there is a lot of epistemology in English or Spanish, but epistemology for Maya, for Zapotec, for Nahuatl, we have very little, very little. So that would be my contribution in teachings of Maya.